Welcome, everybody, to this second in our series of Linda Gilkeson pest identification, problem identification, diagnosing, and crop management. We've had quite a productive first event, and we're pleased to welcome you here to our second in this series. My name's Nick, and I work with the Farmland Trust through the Grow Local project, doing a lot of food system development programming and program development here at the Root. We're super grateful and honored that you decided to join us from wherever you are in the world right now. Imagining there's people from all over the bioregion and possibly from beyond. Regardless of where you're coming from, the land that you live on has been no doubt stewarded by Indigenous people from all over the world since time immemorial. Where I'm standing here in the building, the Root on Bettis Road on Salt Spring. This land was traditionally stewarded by the Hokaminam and Senchothan speaking peoples. And they've been here since before agriculture was even an idea and a concept. And they have a tremendous amount of knowledge and wisdom that is helping us to relearn how to steward land in more healthy and responsible ways. And so I'm excited to be part of the team here at the Farmland Trust that's working to help bring some of those practices back as we collaborate and engage with more traditional knowledge. And we also have some amazing support from our team of partners that have been putting on this event, the BC government, Ministry of Agriculture, Regeneration British Columbia, some of the funders that are helping to put on this knowledge series. And there's links to their websites and information in the slides if you're interested in looking at more details. So tonight, as everybody probably knows, is the second in our series. And this part, we are going to be digging a little bit deeper into specific problems and diagnoses and management solutions to questions that people who were participating in the first series presented and reached out and requested that Linda take some time to really reflect on and offer her guidance and suggestions. So this second series or the second workshop is going to be a really sort of tailored educational offering to the questions that we have as growers in this region. So it's going to be fantastic to have such an in-depth look at some of the common problems and solutions that we're all looking for. Just like last course, we will be inviting people to put questions into the chat if they have them come up during the presentation, and then there'll be some time at the end where Linda will get to some of those questions and try to add some more of her information and guidance too. So questions in the chat, and we'll record those and address them at the end as time allows. Just like last session, we will be recording this event, and that recording will be made available to everybody once we get it edited and up into video format. So stay tuned. We will send out an email once the video is ready for people to view and review and share with others. Our hope is that this information doesn't just help those in the session, but can really be used by other people throughout the years to come. It's my great honor to get to introduce Linda. I'm happy to say that I've been working with Linda on and off for the last few years, collaborating in different ways to do with growing here on the island. We did some work together with the Area Farm Plan and Climate Action Plan, and it's now lovely to get to participate in this course. Linda is a wealth of knowledge. She earned a Ph.D. in entomology from McGill University, and from 1991 to 2002 worked for the provincial government promoting programs to reduce and eliminate pesticide use. And she has just published an expanded third edition of her fantastic pest management guide, West Coast Gardening, Natural Insect, Weed and Disease Control. a must-have for any grower trying to grow plants in this particular climate. We have included her full biography in the chat, and a link to her website. So if you want more information or to be able to order any of her materials, please go to her website. Linda's been super generous sharing her knowledge and information and just helping the growers on the island and beyond be able to grow more and learn how to identify and manage the different challenges that come with growing plants in this region. So my mouth is sufficiently dry. I think I've rambled on enough. Without further ado, I will pass this over to Linda and hope everybody has a fantastic evening.
Thank you, Nick. So, well, it sounds like we've got a big audience tonight. Just to remember that if you just registered for this tonight, you will get the video from the first session that was in September, because it's a really important companion piece to what we're going to talk about tonight, because I'm not really going to repeat what we did there. So I'm going to start talking about prevention. Prevention is the key to most pest and disease problems that affect food crops. We sometimes get into trouble, but once we've managed a situation that's developed, we need to always go back and look at how we can prevent the problem from happening in the first place. And the first one is just don't import problems. Be super aware of some of the things that we can only get by bringing them in on plants. So inspect before you buy. Whiteflies, soft brown scale, mealybugs. Spider mites were particularly problematical this year on a lot of people's gardens and in some greenhouses, and they can't fly. They get to your greenhouse on a plant. And serious diseases, we have a few really, really difficult diseases to deal with. Clubroot of cabbage, white rot of alliums, and then there's always potato diseases. And once you get them in your soil, you really have a very long-term 20-year management problem. So planting stock, starting with really uninfected, clean planting stock is essential. And then the next thing to do in prevention is to grow healthy plants. And actually, you're going to see a lot of that detail in the recording from last month, both on what the causes and the symptoms of plant stress. But just a quick review, plants are stressed by, well, all kinds of things. Extreme temperatures, cold, heat, too much or too little water, waterlogging or drought, lack of or imbalance in the soil nutrients, wrong soil pH for the crop, poor planting and pruning practices, even competition with weeds. So when plants are healthy, then they resist pathogens that cause disease and they resist pest attack. But when they are attacked, they recover more quickly. And this picture is just to remind you that you can have your squash just outgrow powdery mildew. Powdery mildew hits at the end of the season. The plants are kind of failing. Some of the readily available nutrients have been taken up. But if that plant is getting all the water and nutrients it needs, it's scooting right along here, growing out of powdery mildew. And while we're on talking about diseases, prevention is the only way we have to manage most plant disease. And all three factors have to be present for a plant to get ill, just like people. You need a pathogen, the disease organism. You need the environment that causes the pathogen allows it to grow. In the case of fungal diseases, a lot of them grow in high humidity conditions. And you need a susceptible plant. And, if you think of this as a three-legged stool, you only have to remove one leg of a three-legged stool for it to fall down. So you don't have to deal with all of these factors. You just need to take one out of the equation, and that prevents plant disease. And, for example, removing a susceptible plant is growing a plant that's resistant. This is a peonation. This is actually a pea aphid on a pea pod, and aphids spread peonation virus in the summer. Well, it's virtually impossible to have zero aphids in pea plants because one aphid can spread the virus. But if you're growing varieties that really don't get the disease, you have just removed the susceptible plant, and it doesn't matter that the environment is there and the pathogen is there. So that is a key, that's a cornerstone of a lot of pest disease management in crops, is looking for the resistant varieties. So peas, I've already mentioned the Anatian mosaic virus, but there's powdery mildew resistant peas, and same with squash and cucumbers and grapes, resistant to powdery mildews. There are apples and pear varieties that are resistant to scab, which is we didn't see hardly any of it this year because it was a long, hot, dry summer. Excuse me, but last summer, people lost entire tree loads of apples to scab because it was a perfect scab summer. And then clubroot, there are actually now quite a useful list of varieties of cabbage family plants that are resistant to clubroot, which is a really nasty disease. So this is what Peonation virus actually looks like. This is a zucchini plant that's resistant to powdery mildew, growing right in the midst of a patch of plants that have it, and they're completely unaffected. And this is actually what apple scab looks like if you're not familiar. Some examples of removing the disease environment. I mean, mostly it's the weather, and we're not changing that. But in fact, there are some microenvironments that we can manage, in particular for something like late blight, which is actually, it's not a fungus disease. It's a weird group of organisms called water molds. They can only germinate on the leaves if the leaves are actually wet. And so don't get your tomatoes wet. And if you don't get the tomatoes wet, they will never have late blight. And again, not much of a problem this summer at all. But last summer, certainly there was late blight creeping up on quite a few gardens by the end of the summer. So keeping high tunnels over rows of tomatoes keeps off rain. And but they have to be high tunnels and well ventilated, because if condensation forms, that still gets the leaves wet. So wherever the source of the moisture is, whether it's irrigation or rain or condensation, you want to prevent that. So good air circulation, don't splash water on the leaves during irrigation. This is what the drip irrigation systems are ideal for this. And people that are growing plants in containers can grow them along up on a deck or something, or under a roof overhang, so that they just don't get wet in the rain. So there's a number of ways to accomplish this, but keeping the plants dry absolutely puts an end to late blight. Another way in fruit trees, particularly, and actually people do this in ornamentals and for roses and things like that as well, is good air circulation through the foliage dries the leaves off very quickly after there is rainfall or a heavy dew. Really heavy dew can also leave things quite wet. And the quicker those leaves dry, the less time there is for a lot of these pathogens that cause fungus diseases to infect leaves. And this is just an example. As a dwarf tree, the apples on the top of the tree with good sun and air circulation are perfectly fine. And same tree, these apples have scabs so badly that they can't develop at all, and they've had to be taken off. It was down against a fence with a lot of weeds. And, when it got wet down there, the foliage of the apple tree and the fruit just stayed wet for much longer. This is just the same tree. So right there, simply pruning can make a huge difference to susceptibility to pathogens. Another thing that we can do is crop rotation. Crop rotation starves root pathogens. Now, these usually are root rots of some sort. They're organisms, they're fungi, and some are other kinds of organisms that live in the soil, and the spores stay in the soil, and that is the home environment of these organisms. But they have host plants, so they have to, attack the roots of a particular kind of plant. So if it's an allium or a pathogen, if it's something that attacks garlic or onions, you could grow carrots there quite safely because it doesn't attack carrots. On the other hand, if you have something that attacks carrots, it probably won't attack cabbage or cabbage family crops. Clubroot's been a concern. Several people have raised it. You can grow anything in clubroot infected soil except the cabbage family plants, because the host crops are unique to the pathogens have to have their host plant. So when we rotate crops, we basically starve them. The spores cannot last for years and years in the soil. And some exceptions are the two really nasty diseases that I mentioned at the beginning. But most things that cause root rots only survive between 1 and 4 years. And so a 4-year crop rotation is enough to manage that problem and ensure that it doesn't infect the next crop. So 4 years is a good basic crop rotation cycle if you're planning rotations. There is one little warning, and it'll come up as I talk about specific diseases later, is that sometimes there's some unexpected alternate hosts. There's one disease of garlic, root disease, that is also hosted by cereal crops. So if you had rotated cereal crops as a green manure or something between growing your garlic, you might have actually been keeping this pathogen alive. But generally, if you're careful about the plant families, keeping the vegetables with the highest risk of root disease together, like the onion family all together, or the mustard cabbage family all together, then moving those around so that they grow in different places for a few years. Generally, that is the best approach to managing root diseases. We don't have anything else we can do. You can't pour anything into the soil that will work without doing massive damage. And so basically we have to manage in other ways. Now, there are all kinds of other problems. And so where do we start when there's a problem? Well, I showed this slide at the end of the September 19th workshop, and I'll just review it now because it does set us up for how to approach pest problems that we're going to talk about tonight. So you're going to be looking closely. Get a good magnifying glass, or make sure your phone camera, you can use your phone camera zoom function, whatever's easy, but get some ability to really look closely out in the field. And look closely for signs of damage and organisms. And a lot of the beneficial organisms, not just the pests, are hard to see, and we need to know whether they're there or not. So you're looking for spores and fungal mats or hyphae or growth, tiny insects, mites. Frass is insect poop, and actually that can tell you a lot about the kind of pest problem, because a lot of the insects are gone during the day, they're hiding, and they come out at night, but you can tell what the problem has been by what they leave behind. Checking the pattern of damage, this is going to make a lot of sense when you see the September 19th video, a lot more sense possibly, because there are many things that injure plants that can look like disease, but they're caused by extreme heat or frost or something like that. And how if the damage is random or uniform or on only one part of a plant, those are clues as to whether you're actually looking at a disease, or whether you're looking at sun scald, for example, which was very common this summer. Is the damage on all of the same ages of leaves or on different ages of leaves? And what does the new growth look like? If the new growth looks fine, well, it's too bad about the old damage, but probably there isn't a problem anymore. The timing of damage, did it appear suddenly or gradually? Things that appear suddenly are injury. Things that appear gradually usually are something like a pathogen or a disease or an insect or mite buildup. Is the weather wet? Is it hot? Has it been unusually hot or unusually cold? My last point here is that if you're looking up things yourself, everything you read about what you think your suspected problems are has to match. And host plant, and I've emphasized that here, is key. So I've recently was sent a number of different pictures by people asking about problems that they think their plant had, and those plants don't have those problems. The plants had problems, but they didn't have the problems that people thought they did, because the host plant is absolutely key. Almost all pests and almost all pathogens are specific to certain plants. So if it's, somebody was asking me if their apple had leaf curl, nope, I didn't have to look at a picture, because apples don't get leaf curl. They can certainly get damaged leaves. So be very careful that everything matches, and including this region. Many things show up on the internet and you're Googling pictures, and they're not for this particular bioregion. And lots of things occur elsewhere that don't occur here. So those are just some kind of things to clue you in when you're trying to figure this all out. So really what you're going to do is keep an eye on problems. Look closely, do it regularly, and keep records. Now, it's easy to keep photo records. Keep records in any way that makes sense to you. Make notes, have a photo file. You can always check the dates on the photos easily if you're looking from last year to remember what happened. I also think that people should keep weather records, at least the minimum, maximum temperatures, and some idea of the rainfall. And a rainfall gauge it's only a few dollars for a rain gauge. This is all manual stuff. You can find min-max temperatures at any garden thermometers at a garden center. You can get really fancy, and there's certainly electronic gizmos, but you should try and keep min-max temperatures and rainfall, because it's important for pest diagnosing and disease diagnosing. But it's absolutely essential now that the climate is getting so variable, for us to be able to go back and see what the weather has been like, because that's actually biting really hard into our productivity. And we need to know what happened. Anyway, the inspections that you're going to do are going to tell you if whatever the problem is it getting better? You're not seeing any more damage, or has it not changed, or is it getting worse? You're going to look for beneficial insects. And in the process, if it's getting worse, and there are no beneficial insects, if it's a pest problem, do you need to do anything? And the timing is important, because for particular pests, for example, certain controls that you can use that are effective are only effective on one life stage. Like caterpillars, for example, are very susceptible to a bacterial disease that you could use, but the eggs are not, the adults are not, the chrysalises are not. If you do anything, then these inspections also tell you if whatever you did worked. Are you still having a problem? Were the plants damaged? Were the pest problem, is it diminished? So keeping records also helps you know when to look for that problem next year earlier. And I'll just give you a quick example here of once you know when to look for this pest, which is the gooseberry sawfly. It's also called imported currant worm. The one that, halfway through June, you look at your plants and all of the foliage is missing between the veins. It seems like a massive amount of leaf chewing has been done. Well, it starts out with eggs laid on the underside of the leaves in April. And they're laid only over just a 2-week period or so. And that's it for the whole year. Now, I know I've got it on my garden calendar. I know when to go out there and start looking for this, so that I catch the problem at this stage, when all of the eggs are concentrated on just a few leaves in the interior of the bushes. If you remove the leaves that have the eggs at that stage, it's a very small job, you'd never see this happen. So some of these things allow you to, yes, you had damage this year, but they allow you to get right on top of it next year, timed for your particular area. And when I'm saying looking closely for natural enemies, you really have to look. And I personally think that's lots of fun, finding out what's there. This is some aphids on a leaf. These are lady beetle eggs. And this little tiny white thing is a hoverfly or syrphid fly egg. And there's lots of lady beetles in this dill. And the reason that you need to really look closely is this is going to help you decide if you need to do anything. Here we have aphids on a plum leaf. Now that's a lot of aphids. And we have one big fat syrphid fly larva that's going to be one of those beautiful flies when it emerges. Can this insect do the job? Well, actually, yes, it can, because those are all eggs. This many eggs, and these is more than enough when the larvae hatch to absolutely clean those aphids up, because each larva eats hundreds of aphids. So yes, but you can't see that without a good magnification and a good inspection. If you had waded in with soap sprays, what you would end up doing is killing quite a few aphids, but not all of them. The survivors can keep reproducing, but the predators won't come back for a while, because the soap has made the leaves stinky from their point of view. And so the aphids could reproduce, and the predators won't be back for quite some time. And the aphid problem can be made a lot worse, when in fact a good inspection would have shown you that you had no problem. It's time to just go away, and leave this to take care of itself. So that's part of deciding if treatment is necessary. And what comes into this is, what kind of problem is it? Here we have an apple with one caterpillar has caused a lot of damage. You can't sell this apple. Home gardener can make a pie out of the rest of this apple, but this is not a commercial apple. On the other hand, here's one caterpillar. It's a tussock moth, and it's probably chewed this little bit of leaf here. It's absolutely no harm to that tree. So are we talking about one caterpillar or 10 or hundreds? It really depends on what part of the plant they're chewing on, what the insect or it actually does, the type and the age of the damage. For example, here, this is that same gooseberry sawfly. The damage is quite old, though. You can see dry brown edges on here. If I came back every week to inspect this, nothing would have changed. I've missed the window to do anything about it. The damage is done and the creatures are gone. So if it's too old, you know there's nothing you can do this year. And it also tells you whether you can see natural enemies. And I just want to show you this example. Here's a cabbage being badly chewed up by imported cabbage worm, or the white cabbage butterfly larvae. And underneath, that cabbage is actually really quite fine. If you just took the outer leaves off, there's a bit of crop loss there, but in fact, nothing as bad as you would think. The cabbage is fine. On the other hand, this is kale, and that little caterpillar, same caterpillar, is eating directly what I want to eat. So it really depends what it's doing and what species it is. When it comes to the toolbox of things we can do about it, the focus on non-toxic methods is important, because most pests and diseases can be managed by combining the preventative things that we can do and what are called cultural or physical or biological controls. So I'm just going to talk about a few of those as examples. The thing that you really have to remember, though, is that these types of controls only work on certain pests. And they're very specific as well. I mean, back in the terrible old days when people could just put diazinon on everything, whether it worked or not, it worked because it killed pretty much everything. It worked in that sense. And the care that you needed to take to make sure that you tailored your control to the pest problem really wasn't necessary, because you had a very long period of time that diazinon would keep working on, say, carrot rust fly. Well, here is a commercial grower growing carrots, keeping out carrot rust fly with insect netting. But you need to use this correctly. It can't just be sort of applied later in the season. You need to know the life cycle of the carrot rust fly. And this type of barrier works great for this, but it doesn't work on, say, aphids. So you need to know how they work and the timing of using them. So you just have to use them correctly. And, you know, while there's a role for some types of pesticides, they're basically a last resort. Think of them as garden chemotherapy. Really rarely do you need things like soap or pyrethrins or horticultural oils. So the first thing is simply physically removing the pest. Well, we've just gone through a tent caterpillar year, and that's basically the best way to approach tent caterpillars to defend a fruit tree, is remove the eggs, egg masses. Or later you can remove the tents. That's what she's actually doing there with the pole pruner. So removing infested foliage or fruit, pruning out infected branches. Here's a apple branch with European canker. If you take care to prune this out of the apple tree, then it's not likely to spread. And then you destroy the pruned out material. Another physical control is trapping insects. If you've got winter moth, these sticky tree bands can be put up after Canadian Thanksgiving and taken down at the end of January, early February. And the winter moth, which is a species of insect that has, the females can't fly. So when they hatch down here, or they come out of the cocoons in the leaf litter beneath the tree, the females have to walk all the way out to the end of the branches to lay eggs. And a simple sticky band just intercepts them and stops it. But that doesn't work for a species that is any other kind of moth, because the other kind of moth, the females can fly, so the sticky bands have no effect at all. So for winter moth, sticky tree bands are extremely specific and effective. Yellow sticky traps are excellent for trapping white flies and fungus gnats, but really they're only for indoor or greenhouse use. because the yellow traps outdoors also catch a number of beneficial insects. The parasitic wasps that attack aphids are quite attracted to yellow traps. But in greenhouses, there's a role for yellow traps. And these potato chunk traps to remove wireworms from garden beds actually work very well. Water sprays are really a physical control because you're blasting the insects off the leaves. And an insect like the sawfly larvae, which kind of look like they look like small slugs on pear leaves and cherry leaves. Once they're blasted off the tree, they can't walk back up again. Aphids the same way. Aphids have a very fine thread-like mouth part that's screwed into the leaf, and blasting them off with water, probably what the effectiveness of water sprays is that you're breaking that, damaging the mouth part so they can't feed again. So there are a number of insects for which water sprays work as well as trying to spray anything else. And because powdery mildews are an interesting group of fungi, they need air, humid air, but dry leaves to germinate. And when there's free water on a leaf, powdery mildews can't germinate. So that's why water sprays help with that. Another physical control that works on a lot of different things in different ways are barriers. If you just stop the insect from reaching the whatever it is, the fruit or the leaves or the roots, in this case, under this netting is carrots. So we're stopping carrot rust fly from reaching the roots of the plant. And laying their eggs, and they can't reach the plant, you have a perfect crop. Of course, the trick is that you have to install the barrier before the insects show up, and the barrier has to be in place for whatever the egg laying cycle is. So you need to know the insect's life cycle. If the insect only has one generation a year, like currant fruit fly, I need to cover my currant bushes for about 3 weeks, and then I uncover them, and then we're good. Carrots, there's 3 generations a year of carrot rust fly, so basically you cover them till the end of October. So it could be a few weeks, it could be a few months. You just really need to know what you're dealing with. A barrier that actually, that's what's in this picture here, are barriers around the stems. I think there's probably cauliflower in the picture, but cabbage root maggots are an insect quite similar to carrot rust fly. The adults come in and lay their eggs in the evening right at the junction of the stem and the soil. And if that is an unpleasant place for them to lay their eggs, they won't lay their eggs out here. And they're not going to go lay them on lettuce plants or something else. They only want the cabbage family plants. So we put a little simple barrier here. That's it for the life of that plant. That's all you have to do. And, this is feasible in a garden. A commercial grower has other options. There are other things that have to be done because this is probably not going to be feasible on a field scale. But in a home garden, a simple square cut to the middle with a little slit here so that it's really possible to get that tightly up against the stem. And this picture showing a few pebbles holding it down, but you can just put the mulch right over the top of it, and that's it for the season. So that's another type of barrier. You can cover whole plants. This example of the red currant bush here is the one I just mentioned. I just snapped some insect netting over the plants for a few weeks in the spring. And these kinds of nettings are now they're a lot more easily available. They have brand names are Protect Net and Enviro Mesh and Bug Out. And some garden centers sell them by the meter or the yard, and they're extremely durable. This is not like floating row cover, which will rip if it's used over bushes and trees. This stuff is tough, very, very tough and long lasting. Lets in the sun, lets in the rain, but it doesn't let in insects. For soft plants, you can use floating row cover, like on strawberries and vegetables such as carrots, but it isn't a long-lasting product. And you can cover individual fruit. Now, this sounds tediously crazy, except that it's a standard method for commercial organic apple growing in Washington State. These commercial waxed bags, it's a paper bag with a little twist tie. It is more economical to cover that apple with a bag and then not have codling moth, apple maggot, apple scab, and woodpecker damage, or birds or yellow jacket damage, or all kinds of damage. All of it is stopped by a barrier around the fruit. It's more economical to put that bag on than it is to be spraying. So it is, in fact, quite effective. Of course, this is going to be very difficult if you have a 20-foot tall apple tree. It makes a lot more sense in a home garden with a small dwarf tree that you can reach all the apples. But there are all kinds of bags and berries and homemade ones, the organza gift bags that you can buy wholesale, really easy to just zip them onto things. They have a little drawstring thread here. Lots of different options here. If the bags are strong enough, then raccoons can't get grapes, for example. They would get this kind of bag off of a grapevine, but this kind of tough bag like this, instead of covering the whole grapevine, you could just cover the fruit, if you want. In our stable of biological controls, there's really two kinds of biological controls or natural enemies available. There's the whole wide world of thousands of native insects and mites that attack all kinds of our common pests: aphids, caterpillars, sawflies, thrips, rust mites, spider mites. There are usually far more of these present than you think, because you really would be surprised how common they are and how many there are. And then there are the ones you can buy. So really, for an outdoor crop, there are only just a couple of the biocontrols that you can buy commercially or much use outdoors. They are actually used in commercial greenhouses in BC widely, and there are not quite a few species available. But compared to the wealth of species that are here already, the wild species, for most of us, the best bet is going to be attracting and protecting all of these native species. I mean, there are literally thousands of insects that are predatory or parasitic. This is a few of the ones that attack aphids. This is a lady beetle, and this is a lady beetle larva. If you're not familiar how strange those little alligator-shaped creatures look, those are actually the immature stage of lady beetles. This little tiny orange thing that never gets any bigger than this, it's a maggot. It's from what's called an aphid midge, and they're probably the most effective aphid predator in the environment, and they're really not easy to see. This is a parasitic wasp that is injecting an egg inside an aphid, and this is a larva of one of those hoverflies that is feeding, and they're really voracious. Now, this picture shows that there are at least three kinds of aphid enemies visible here. The aphid midge, there's an orange thing there, an orange thing there, an orange thing there. Those would all be the larvae of that midge. Here's a big fat hoverfly or syrphid fly larva. Here are these pearly things, are aphids that have been parasitized by that little tiny parasitic wasp. And that's just what we're looking at on, from the top. If you were to take that into a lab and maybe lift up all of these insects and look underneath, you would see eggs of all of these things tangled up into the mess of the aphids. So planting to attract them and feed them is a really key strategy in any pest management, because most all of these adult predatory and parasitic insects, the adults are eating pollen and nectar. The adults are not the predators. Lady beetles are an exception. Lady beetle adults also eat aphids, for example, but they also eat pollen and nectar. But the other things, all the hoverflies and all those little parasitic wasps, they have to have their own food to have enough energy to lay eggs, and their food is pollen and nectar. And it's been well established, and it's widely used in agricultural systems, that where the female beneficial insects find their food is where they first start searching for places to lay their eggs. Now, they will only lay their eggs on the insects that their larvae need to eat. So if it's an aphid predator, she's going to fill up here on a dandelion or something, and then buzz off into the nearest plants and start looking for aphids to lay her eggs on. And many of these tiny flowers fit these tiny insect mouth parts. There's a lady beetle in the dill. Sweet alyssum has become a commercial farming darling. It's used, this is a picture of an Ontario strawberry field. It's used in commercial lettuce in California. it is so valuable to attract aphid predators into the lettuce that it's worth the loss of lettuce crop to provide some rows of sweet alyssum in these big fields. In Ontario, they're using them to attract pirate bugs into the strawberries to control thrips. So it's extremely attractive plant to a wide enough variety of insects that it can be employed as a large-scale commercial insect attractant, attracting and feeding. Don't forget that insects need water in the summer. When it's hot and dry in our region, if there's no water, many of these insects have much shorter lives and they don't lay nearly as many eggs. So providing water is a pretty good idea, actually, to optimize the beneficial insects. But they can fall into water and drown. The tiny little parasitic wasps get caught in the surface tension and they can't get out again. So leaving them a beach. Here's a little bee beach here. And bees slide into a plastic container of water, and bees can't climb the sides. They just drowned. So anything that they can get a grip on lets them haul themselves out. So just keep it out of reach of little kids and pets, because wasps come to these as well. And we do want wasps visiting. Wasps are major predators of caterpillars and flies. And just be common sense about mosquitoes breeding in the water. There are a lot of ground-dwelling insects that are, and in this case, the pillbug predator here, the spider, that are very important. And you don't see them unless you're out at night walking your dog really late with a flashlight. You probably don't know how many ground beetles are scurrying all over your pathways and gardens in the evening. So the way we protect them is, well, minimizing cultivation, which there are many reasons for minimizing cultivation, but this one is particularly for protecting the ground-dwelling predators, and keeping soil covered with mulches and living plants, having undisturbed pathways, and the garden style of permanent beds with permanent pathways particularly suits a lot of these predators, because it gives them refuges when you're having to disturb a little bit of an area to replant something. It gives them a stable place to live. And many of the predatory insects that I showed you in some of the preceding slides, while the larvae are feeding on the leaves, sure, they're up on the plant, but they actually drop to the soil for their pupation period, when they have to be somewhere safe and moist, so that the adult can develop inside and come popping out. And so a very important aphid predators, for example, must be have really a safe layer of surface layer of soil to go into that isn't disturbed. Just a few of, I love this. There's my little rogues gallery here. If you thought this was a wireworm, I just want you to know that this is a predator on wireworms. It looks like a white wireworm. It's exactly the same size and shape and location of a wireworm in your garden. But the white ones are good guys. There's a very beautiful fly that this is. This wireworm will actually, predator attacks wireworms and chews holes in them. This little guy eats pill bugs. This is the immature stage of beetles like this. Now, there are biocontrols you can buy, and should you buy them? Well, there's not very many that are really useful in a garden. There are some for aphids, for example, and spider mites, but most of them that are, in fact, for sale are for use in the commercial greenhouse crops. They are very expensive and they're perishable, and you really need to know what you're doing to use them effectively. For example, mite predators, if you're trying to buy predatory mites and it's not the right mite predator, and because you don't have the mite correctly identified, that may not work. One of the things that I was quite shocked at this year was how many people got a hold of me saying that they'd seen praying mantids. Mantids have gotten established in the area. People have been letting them out. This is not a native species. The problem with praying mantids is they just eat anything. They could eat a butterfly. They'll eat lacewings, which are beneficial. They just grab what they can get. Most of what they're going to eat is not pests, because most insects are not pests. So when they're small, they eat small things, and when they're bigger, they eat bigger things. And they're not in any sense a biological control for a pest problem. because they can thrive on just eating any insects that they get. And so they don't affect a pest population, discriminately. Unlike this aphid midge, which you can buy, which is very specific, only eats aphids, and it stays right where you put it. If you release it in your garden, it's not going to fly away like lady beetles do. The only thing is, though, that they're native here, and there's lots of them if you have a garden or a field that you're managing to protect them. So there are some biocontrols that are useful, but mostly that's not the first place to go for help in managing pests, because the freebies, the native species, that's the first place to go, is to attract and feed them. There are insect parasitic nematodes that some of you will have heard about. Tiny little parasitic worms, and they actually are mass produced in factory settings, really, and survive shipping them because they're in a dried stage that's dormant. These do attack insects, but the best results are on weevil larvae and some kinds of beetles, but you have to use the correct species of nematode. So there's a little more to it than that. For garden pests, or for food crops, generally, they're not that useful. For some of the ornamental crops and for lawns and things like that, they're really very good. But you need to know what you're doing. They're expensive and they're perishable. Now, one of the things that has just my pet peeve about this industry of insect parasitic nematodes is because they're big enough, they are not required to be registered as pesticides. So in Canada, so a bacterium, the bacterial disease that kills caterpillars, has to be registered as an insecticide. But the nematodes are bigger than that, so they're not. So the industry is not, frankly, adequately regulated. So people will sell you nematodes and tell you they're going to work on a lot of things that they do not work on outdoors. If you trap nematodes in a petri dish with insects in a lab, they'll pretty much attack anything, because sooner or later that insect will get the nematodes inside it. But in the real world, they are not doing that. And they're expensive. So they're something that you probably won't use for most things that most growers would need to manage. They wouldn't be using nematodes. This is the bacterial disease for caterpillars that I mentioned, the BTK. It controls some species of caterpillars. It's obviously, we want to protect the native species of caterpillars. So this isn't something to spray on native plants where the native caterpillars are. This is something that you target on, for example, cabbage plants for imported cabbage worm or that cabbage butterfly. It's only effective for a few days, and the caterpillars have to eat it, and it paralyzes their gut as the bacteria grows. And they basically die of blood poisoning. It's a pretty horrible fate for little caterpillars. The kinds of least toxic pesticides that are a last resort, unfortunately, are often thought of as the first thing. People will tell me, well, I sprayed this and now what? And it's like, well, I really wished I'd had the now what first, because we usually don't need to get to a position where we need to spray anything. And often, as I gave the example earlier, once we do spray, we're locked into the spray cycle, because if you make the leaves smelly from the point of view of beneficial insects, and they're not going to come back and attack the aphids because at some point you use pyrethrins on those leaves, then you're locked into always spraying. So these are really last resort kind of things. The bacterial disease for caterpillars and the kaolin clay, which I'll talk about more later, those are, and the slug baits, these have the least risk for beneficial insects and the least likelihood of repelling them. But when we start getting into pyrethrins and soap sprays and sulfur sprays and things like that, those have side effects. They kill other organisms that they get on, and they have this effect of repelling beneficials. One of the things that another sort of pet peeve of mine is the idea that you routinely use dormant oil spray on your fruit trees in the wintertime. Dormant oil, which is an oil that's actually just made emulsified in water so that you can spray it on something, works great. on the things it works on, but it doesn't work on a lot of things. It does not work on caterpillar eggs or codling moths. It does work on aphid eggs, which you almost never see in a home orchard, and winter moth eggs and some of these scale insects. If you had an apple that looked like this with these funny little gooey insects on it, yes, that would be a good indication you should use a dormant spray. But if you don't have a pest for which they work, then there isn't any point in spraying it. It's an unnecessary use of pesticides. And people often say, well, no, I'm just going to use organic stuff, natural insecticides. Well, really, those, if they work, they're going to kill beneficial insects as well. Now, pyrethrum daisy sounds very benign, but the extracts, the pyrethrins that come from those daisies are nerve toxins. They have a very fast knockdown effect. And they affect any insect. I mean, bees, butterflies, everybody. If anybody's in the way when you're spraying, they're going to be affected. They are actually considered moderately toxic, which is a category of toxicity to people and pets. And so, if you're going to use it, they have to be treated with the care that any kind of insecticide would be used. Extreme care. You need protective clothing. And homemade sprays, they're just right off the table. Okay, if you're a certified organic grower, you're not using these because they're not legal and your certification would not cover that. But I mean, would allow that. A commercial grower would not be using these. Again, they're just actually not legal. Nobody's going to show up in your backyard and tell you not to make a homemade mix. But what you're doing is that you can be killing or damaging plants, especially things like the dish soap and detergents and homemade oil mixes and borates and alcohol. Things that you hear people mixing up and putting on their plants can easily damage leaves or kill plants, and they'll certainly kill beneficial insects and mites. And I didn't even talk about all the beneficial microbes that are on leaves. There's a whole nother world of invisible fungi and bacteria that are beneficial on leaves that prevent pathogens from being able to get into leaves, for example. And those are also killed by these kinds of products. So, and then there's the problem of making the leaf smell funny, so the biocontrol insects avoid it. So if these would work on a pest, they will kill beneficial things. Now, that was a review, and I want to start on this list of the requests that did come in ahead of time here. We'll probably maybe take about 15 minutes, I hope, and then we can open it up to more general questions. Oddly enough, at the top of the list was pill bugs, which some people really have a problem with this. It's not really a commercial grower problem that I know of. But it is, they thrive. They're not insects, they're little crustaceans, and they thrive in wet conditions. So rotting wood, wet mats of organic matter and debris, that's their home. They also have very weak jaws, so they can't really damage anything that's gotten well established and has growing very well. They can nibble on fine root hairs, they can nibble on seedlings when they just germinate. And they can scritch away on very soft tissue like a cucumber or something when it's very, very small, the fruit. After the plants are grown larger than that, they really are not damaged by pill bugs. So one of the first things to do is clear mulches and everything off the soil for seed when you're seeding and putting in seedlings, or whether you're sowing seed. Keep the surface dry. Water, if they have to be watered, water early in the day so that the soil surface dries out by evening. And just, keep the mulch really away, and you can just push that mulch back after the plants are a good size. One of the garden crops that really gets nailed by these is beans. And you may not know why your beans have come up and they just have the centers nibbled out. The new leaves are all nibbled. What's going on here, I suspect, is that the starchy seed leaves of the beans, when they're in the soil, they're fermenting a bit, because we always do this. Everybody plants beans a little too early and the soil is cool. And even if you don't, there's still, rot that can happen to that really starchy leaf. Fermenting starch is super attractive to pill bugs. So they come buzzing over here and start nibbling on these leaves. And this first tissue of these new leaves is really, really soft. And they just chew it all up because that's where they are. Now, when the plants are bigger, they can't do that. So one way around it is to start your beans in flats elsewhere, away from the pill bugs, and put them out as soon as they have 2 leaves, because at this stage, they're not going to be damaged by pill bugs. Another possibility is just planting later. If you use an early variety of beans, but plant it later, you may still get an early crop that you're hoping to have. And then this spider that I showed you, this is actually a wider view of the picture I just showed you. This is their main diet. So when you see the spider, spiders are actually pretty common. So growing seedlings out as large as possible. The other thing they can do is they can kind of chew on the ends of cucumbers. When the cucumber is this tiny, they can chew on it. So putting them up on slippery plinths, yogurt containers upside down, cottage cheese pots, melons and cucumbers are often protected from the damage until the skin gets tough, because they can't climb, the pill bugs can't climb this. Sometimes cold frames in greenhouses, the pill bug numbers really build up because it's a humid environment. And you can, during whenever you're changing over crops, whenever there's a period when maybe the greenhouse or the cold frame is empty, close it up tight and let it heat up in the sun. And that just drives them out. They either die or leave. I've done this to my greenhouse and actually seen them pouring out under the door to get out of that environment. The damage that they can do to roots of cucurbits, the squash and cucumber family, they seem to be able to get onto some of these and really scritch away at individual plants. And the only thing I found is that grow the plants fairly good size, the seedlings, before they're put out, and then plant them deep enough that the roots that could be damaged are really deep in the soil. Okay, 2-spotted spider mites. A lot of people had problems with these last summer. The only way you get spider mites is, as I mentioned before, is they initially get to your garden on something. So always inspecting, if somebody, friends giving you a plant, you might just ask about that or have a good look at it tactfully, but inspect before you buy. They can do a lot of damage on house plants. They come in on ornamentals that way. In greenhouse crops like cucumbers and melons, they really like those kinds of plants. But when they're outdoors in a garden, they get onto beans and squash family and eggplants and peppers. They actually can get onto quite a few different plants if they have time to spread. But what you're looking for is this fine stippling. The surface of a leaf may just look like it has little speckles all over it. If you had a good magnifying lens or looked under a microscope, you would actually see little mites with a spot on either side of their body. These round things are their eggs, by the way. And these mites, they reproduce incredibly fast the hotter and drier it gets, partly because their reproduction is coupled to their food intake, and their food intake speeds up the hotter it gets. Also to prevent them from drying up, they keep drinking out of the cells of the leaves quickly to get moisture, and that drives a massively much faster reproduction. So maintaining high humidity in greenhouses, trying to keep the temperatures down, that will slow these population reproduction down. Once they get into your garden or your greenhouse, they can overwinter there, and they get into the cracks and the crevices in the greenhouse structure and debris in the garden. One year, I meant to put this in here. I had a picture. I had them in my bean plants. At the end of the season, when I took the bamboo stakes down that the beans would have been trellised on, they were completely full of spider mites that had crawled inside the bamboo to overwinter. This particular species of mite turns red in the fall when it's an overwintering stage. And I had these bamboo canes completely full of spider mites. So they can then survive the winter, and then you really have them next year. They're also easily spread. You just have to brush by a plant, and they get on your sleeves and your pants legs, and they get to somebody else's garden or more plants in your garden. To diagnose this, now this is a really severe case. You can actually see the webbing on top of it. You can see where you see a little bit of webbing here. But mostly, like when you're on this sort of situation, you don't see the webbing. If you turn the leaf over and just dust a little bit of white powder, a little bit of flour or talcum or something, you will see the webbing showing up very, very easily. That's quite diagnostic. Now, these are hard to control. Native biocontrols will come in. You'll see little tiny beetles and pirate bugs and little mites and things. You can spray to keep them in check if the coverage is really thorough, but you will not eliminate them. On woody plants, you can use dormant oil sprays, and on pyrethrin sprays on foliage during the growing season. Soap doesn't even, the soap, insecticidal soap doesn't really work that well. It's just barely holds the line. In a greenhouse, you can heat shock a greenhouse to clean it out. And as long as you're not putting infested plants back in it, that can actually clean out the mites. It's best to do it in really early, as early in the spring as you can, because there'll be mites overwintering in the frame of the greenhouse. Clean everything out of the greenhouse and close all the vents in sunny weather and just let it heat and heat and heat for a week or so. And then and this is one of the few cases for home gardens where biocontrols are actually really the most effective. It's probably worth, I think it's worth, paying what it costs to put predatory mites out. The specialist predatory mite for two-spotted mite is this little red orange fellow here, Persimilus. But there are other mites, and the suppliers you can get some mixtures of mites, or you can get other mites. I quite like this little guy. He's not hardy. He won't live through the winter, but on the other hand, they're remarkably effective. And it can take a season for the whole summer to completely limit the spider mites, but they will. They are capable of eliminating spider mites in a greenhouse or a garden. So releasing them early. Now, they do need high humidity and moderate temperatures too, which is helpful in slowing the two-spot mite population down anyway. But if you have a very hot, dry greenhouse, these mites are not going to thrive until fall. The predatory mites won't thrive until fall. Several people asked about cabbage flea beetles or crucifer flea beetles. If you see anything in your cabbage family with little round holes, these are called shot holes, and it's a typical damage pattern for flea beetles, which are in fact about the size of a flea or even smaller. I'm trying to show you a picture there, and they jump. They're remarkably like fleas. They're teeny little things. They really are not related to fleas at all. But you often don't see them because by the time you've disturbed the leaf, they've shot off the leaf and you didn't notice that. So they're teeny tiny little insects, but they chew pits in the leaves and eventually chew holes right through. The ones that attack cabbage family plants usually have only one generation a year, although there can be a second generation later in the season, but mostly it's one generation. They overwinter as adults, and they crawl away and hide in debris and shrubs and things near the field or the garden. They come out early in the spring and they feed on plants, and then they start laying their eggs in the roots of the plants. And although this shot hole damage is visible, it's rarely particularly harmful to the plant. What's really harmful to the plant is the larvae that are feeding in the roots of the plant that you can't see. But plants will be stunted, plants can be killed, and they just don't produce the way they should. And so they feed in the roots until the middle of the summer. And when this next generation of adults comes out, they again feed on the leaves, but they're not laying eggs. So they're just doing leaf damage. And then that's when they move out to their overwintering spots. The problem is that you can get really high numbers building up in farm fields or gardens that have these just year after year after year. And really the most effective way is to deal with them is to break their life cycle by removing their access to cabbage family plants. That means if you're a commercial grower, quite a bit of planning has to go in as to when you can, be completely not have cabbage family, mustard greens or leafy greens or broccoli or anything available to these insects. But it can even one season of breaking that life cycle can make a huge difference to the kind of populations you have the following year. So there's a couple strategies here when you're dealing with them. You can simply prevent the adults that emerge in the spring from reaching your crop plants. So removing any host plants that are still in the garden, whether it's old cabbage family plants or it's weeds that are in that family, get them out of the garden or the field before April. And then don't plant any of these kinds of plants again until as late as possible, that you can possibly fit your crop cycle as late as possible. June is better than May, for example. Another way to remove the host plants is cover seed beds and seedlings with insect netting or floating row cover at the time of seeding or planting. So when the adults come out, they still can't reach the seedlings. So you can plant your plants early, your crop early, but cover it with netting. Now, where there's extremely high numbers building up, if you can also intercept the adults before they migrate to the overwintering sites, this is one of the few places that a pyrethrin spray might be justified. It's in September, and if there's a lot of adults, they're feeding, but they're not laying eggs. So if you get those adults under control before they overwinter, there's no part of the life cycle that you're not seeing, no larvae and eggs that are going to come later. So you can do a knockdown then. And you can combine this with trap plants. If you're trying to grow broccoli or cabbage, the waxy-leaved brassicas, they're not as attractive to these insects as leaf mustards, which are very attractive. They love leaf mustards. Here you can see how tiny they are. There's the two little beetles there. There's one there. So you can actually plant leafy greens that the flea beetles love and lure them away from your other brassica crops. And it also, it doesn't just remove them from those crops, but it also gives you a place where you could spray pyrethrins on the adults before they go into the overwintering sites without having to put pyrethrins on your food crop. So there are some sort of push-pull effects with trap plants. And while we're on the subject of the crucifer flea beetles, I threw in these slides on tuber flea beetles because exactly the same damage appears on potatoes, tomatoes, and related plants in some places. And it's another kind of flea beetle. This one only feeds on the nightshade family. It's not going to go on your cabbage family, but the damage looks the same. In this case, this insect has several generations a year. So making sure that there's no volunteer potatoes coming up in the spring to host these first emerging flea beetles, covering your plants with netting in the beginning part of the season. Once they get to a good size, tomatoes are not really bothered by this. There are some larvae feeding in the roots, but the plant's very vigorous. The problem really becomes this kind of damage to potatoes. This is what the tuber flea beetle larvae do to the potatoes. Now, in a home garden, the damage is really close to the surface and you can salvage most of that, but obviously that is not a commercial potato. So you can again do the same thing with pyrethrin sprays on potato leaves in September to reduce their overwintering numbers. Someone did ask about tent caterpillars. I hope by now that a lot of us are pretty familiar with this little critter. It's always a surprise, though, to some people that they can get into such high numbers. This is a species, it's called an outbreak species, and its normal cycle is to gradually increase over a number of years and get to this huge population, which then allows all their predators and parasites and diseases to build up and wipe them out, just about to zero, and then they gradually build up again. Now that cycle can take 7 years to 11 years. I think on Salt Spring here, it's been 11 or 12 years since we had a really bad tent caterpillar, the previous wave of tent caterpillars. So the moths lay their eggs on the trees in anytime really in midsummer, right through they lay their eggs in midsummer and the eggs stay on the trees through the winter. Anytime you see tent caterpillar egg masses, these silvery little, looks like gray foam, silver gray foam, anytime you see them, you can pop them off. But they won't hatch until April. So you've got all winter when you're doing your pruning to remove these little masses. You can see there's hundreds of eggs underneath this. This is what it looks like inside. And this is a first hatching tent caterpillar egg mass. If you were to remove it at this stage, that is, you've just controlled quite a few tent caterpillars. So the populations naturally peak, whether you do anything or not. You could just stand back with your hands in your pockets, and the coming and going of tent caterpillars will be exactly the same. When they have parasitic flies, parasitic wasps. This is fly eggs that have been laid on this caterpillar, little white eggs that will hatch, and the maggots will bore inside the caterpillar. So, you know, that you'll see that first. You can't see the wasps because they're wasp eggs because they're injected inside the caterpillar. But the thing that really takes them off the board is when the colonies get crowded, they just get massive epidemics of disease. And this is a tent caterpillar nest with dead tent caterpillars hanging all over it. They just overnight swept through this entire bush and they're dead. So, you know, what to defend during an outbreak really comes down to your cropping trees and or rose bushes and things like that as well. If a tree is severely defoliated, not just a bit of chewing, but it's really had a lot of leaves removed, then it can ruin this year's crop. You shouldn't let that poor tree try and continue to have the crop that it probably set. The tree will be fine. It just has to recover. It'll grow by halfway through the summer. It'll have all new leaves and you'll forget that it ever happened. But it's really too much to expect fruit trees to be completely defoliated and to produce a crop. So, you know, do what you can, manually remove egg masses, prune out nests. You can spray BTK if you've got big trees and you can't reach any of these nests. I consider a last resort. It's a fairly expensive pesticide. And when caterpillars wander out of the trees in search of more food or pupation sites, then that's when they can tend to get into raspberries and strawberry bushes and blueberry bushes. The moths don't lay their eggs on those berry bushes. The moths lay their eggs on tree branches. But if there's not enough food in the trees, for example, an alder tree along your roadside may just have had a huge number of egg masses laid on it, and the caterpillars have eaten all the leaves off the alder, and then they go fanning out through the neighborhood looking for more things to eat. And that's when they start eating your raspberry bushes and your blueberry bushes and your roses. And if they're still hungry when they're wandering, they can eat a fair bit. And you can spray those as they wander once they come off the trees. So if there's a little bit of defoliation or partial defoliation of some branches on the fruit trees, then it's not really an issue. You can be judicious about how much of a crop you leave on your trees. You know, the trees are pretty tough. I know horticulturists that like to say trees are over-engineered. They have a lot of spare leaves. So just because there's some tent caterpillar damage doesn't mean there's any injury to the tree or loss of crop. But when you get total defoliation, the tree will survive, but you should have tried to defend that tree earlier if you wanted to bear a crop. And actually, you know, like I say, if you just wait, it'll be gone in a year or two. So, and then, you know, there'll be years before it comes back and people tend to forget that it ever happened. Now, clubroot of cabbage, how are we doing for time here? I think we're doing okay for time. Clubroot of cabbage, several people asked about this, and this is a particularly thorny problem because this is one of those pathogens that lives in the soil that can live there a long time. Some spores can last 20 years in the soil without any host plants being there. They don't all last. I mean, after 4 years, there's a drop off in the number of spores. But this is a weird organism. It's an amoeba. It's not a fungus. But the spores last in the soil, and they only germinate. Think of them as little seeds. They only germinate when a cabbage family plant root gets near the spore. And it's basically the mustard oil compounds in the leaves wake up the spore, and the spore attacks the roots. And then they develop in the roots and cause these well, they're really tumors. They look like tumors. And the plants can be completely killed or it's just severely stunted. The organism thrives in warm, not hot soil, but warm soil and wet soil and acid soil. So low pH is a problem. And actually, the cabbage family plants do a lot better if the pH is closer to 7. So one of the first things you can do is just apply adequate lime to keep the pH up. But I would say, actually, I should back up and say the best thing you can do is don't get it. This is one of those ones that's so nasty and so long-lived that if there's any possible way to not get it, unfortunately, a lot of community gardens have it, and it gets moved around very easily. I mean, you can walk it around on your boots. The trowel that you lend to somebody, and somebody gives you a little plant from their garden because they have extras. So that's how you get clubroot. It doesn't fly around. It gets brought to your soil on plants or in something that has soil on it. So cleaning and sterilizing, if you're renting cultivating equipment, borrowing it, even if it's a shovel. Don't accept plants with soil on the roots from other people's gardens unless you know that they know they don't have clubroot. Growing your own plants from seed, that ensures that you're planting seedlings that absolutely don't have it. The garden center's seedlings are always in soilless mixes, so that is not where the clubroot is coming from. I have had some cases where people have bought a cabbage starts from the local nursery, planted it in the garden. The cabbage has clubroot. They blame the nursery. Well, the clubroot was already in the soil because it wouldn't have come from seedlings that were growing in soilless mixes. I mean, that's extremely unlikely. It's far more likely that it was simply dormant in the soil where the cabbage was put in, and now suddenly you see it. And this is another view of the kind of damage you can see. And anywhere, if you know that there's soil around in gardens, don't go there. Don't walk in it. Don't visit it if it's known to have clubroot. So prevention, obviously, in this case it's so essential, but unfortunately it's moving around. So if you've got it, maintaining a high soil pH is going to be very helpful. Using really long crop rotations. The 4 years is a real minimum. 7 years is much better. The faster the maturing a cabbage family variety is, the quicker it can be established before the soil is warm enough for clubroot to really get reproducing. And always cleaning and sterilizing tools if they've been used in infected soil, or actually better yet, especially if it's a garden, just go to a garage sale and get some extra trowels and a trowel and a fork or whatever it is you use as tools, and stick them in that bed and don't take them out so that you're not tempted to just this once use one of your clean tools in that contaminated soil. And then there's actually a lot of progress been made in recent years. It's very hopeful of clubroot tolerant or resistant varieties of cabbage family plants. Now, a lot of seed houses have one or two things. I think West Coast Seeds had Red Lodero, which is a cabbage. William Dam had a seed or two. So there's a few seeds from some of these plants in most garden seed houses. But Osborne Seeds actually has a very extensive list of broccoli, turnip, radish, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, Chinese cabbage. So I know people that have grown some. We got some on Salt Spring here one year from someone that had picked them up in England. And here's one of the cabbages, a Calaxy, that was beautiful. It was growing in very known infected soil. In fact, some of the pictures I've showed you earlier came from that soil, but this cabbage did fine. So there is some hope here: high pH, a lot of care, early varieties, and growing your tolerant varieties. And if you know that you've had infected soil, then never ever, I don't care how many years it's been, don't ever move anything from your soil to anyone else's garden, not on boots, equipment, seedlings. Don't give them dahlia tubers, that were in the soil, because those all are ways to move around clubroot. In this case, there are some other hosts for clubroot to beware of. That these plants don't get sick. They don't look like they're ill, but they can keep the spores of the plasmodium going. And so, you can, the 7-year rotation, if you keep growing red clover or something, or have strawberries, those are alternate host plants, oddly enough, that will keep clubroot surviving. So they don't have these tumors on the roots, but they don't show any damage themselves. But just be aware that in the case of clubroot, there are a few things for gardening, it's strawberries and clovers to be aware of. I did get a question about brown rot fungus. This is a real easy to deal with. It can totally destroy your stone fruit crop, but it is actually a very easy one to deal with. This fungus spreads quickly onto as the fruit is ripening, or if it's in heavy rainfall, or it can spread during just as the blossoms are dropping and the fruit is beginning to form. It can get in at any stage. It's, just makes lots of nice brown spores and sporulates, and off the spores go. The fungus overwinters in the fruit trees on mummified fruit. This is an early spring view of a peach tree, and this is a peach that shriveled up and stayed on the branch the whole winter. And the only peaches that'll shrivel up and stay on the branch in the whole winter are ones that have brown rot. So had this person gone out in the middle of the winter and knocked that peach mummy off the tree and just disposed of it or buried it, they would considerably have eliminated the spores that would rain down on the plants into the flowers in the spring. So the rain just carries the spores. So thinning fruit so that it's not rubbing together, harvesting the fruit before, if it's overripe and it's sitting on the tree virtually starting to rot, and then avoid that. And then in the winter, just knocking those mummified fruits out of the trees and destroying them. This is what it would look like in the summer. A little later in the fall, as the mummified fruit is shriveling up, here's a plum behind it that looks okay, but the whole thing's, they kind of just stick together because they're too crowded. And this is what a completely mummified fruit looks like staying in the trees. Well, that's where the fungus is. You just remove it, destroy it. You may not see this fungus for years. Apple scab, common last year, hardly saw it this year. This is a fungus disease that has many generations. This pathogen, it continually makes spores starting pretty early in the spring. It overwinters on the old leaves that fell off the apple tree. And rain splashes spread it in the spring, and the spores splash back up on the trees, and then a cycle starts on the trees. So it can be infecting leaves, fruit, and here are blossoms that have died completely. This is quite severe. Often what we see is just a few spots on apples. Nothing as severe as this. Doesn't prevent those apples from being used or used as cider or eaten. It's really not a problem. When it's a really severe problem is that there's a lot of wet weather in the spring and everything becomes so infected that you actually lose flowers, and fruit like this just can't develop. The fastest way out of this whole thing is resistant varieties. There are actually quite a few apples that are resistant to scab or tolerant to it, so that they don't, most years they show little or no scab, and only in a really bad weather year would we see scabby apples. And I'll just show you last year the difference. These are my apple trees. I have a Gala, and this Royal Gala has to be the most scab susceptible apple on the planet outside of Cox's Orange Pippin. And that's what happened. I didn't get any salvageable apples out of my trees. Even the blossoms died. This is an early stage, but by October, this is what the apples looked like. In the same garden, not 12 feet away, I suppose, is a Honeycrisp tree, which is resistant. I have not sprayed this tree or done anything to it. The apples were perfect. The harvest was perfect. It was just, no problem. So it can make a huge difference just choosing the right trees. Pear scab is a very similar organism. It doesn't go back and forth between pears and apples. It is a different fungus, but it's just on European pear. This one overwinters on leaves that fall off the trees as well. But in this case, some pear scab also overwinters on the branches. So in the case of pear scab, a dormant lime sulfur spray actually can help control scab. Dormant lime sulfur sprays don't help with apple scab at all because the fungus is overwintering on the ground underneath the trees. And with pears, there are some quite delightful. I'm growing Rescue and Bosque myself and Orchis. I have all three of these, and they're quite delightful pears, and they're quite resistant. So generally, both apple scab and pear scab are managed the same way. The resistant varieties is the primary, most effective approach. Pruning to maintain good air circulation. You saw that example earlier. Don't have an irrigation system that wets leaves. Most people don't anymore, but don't spray water on the leaves. Sulfur during the growing season is one of those really last resort issues, starting after the first bloom. But once you start spraying sulfur, you really have to keep it up. So in the fall, if you've had apple scab, then removing and composting the fallen leaves will control. Once those leaves have deteriorated, the scab fungus can't overwinter there anymore. So raking up and composting, excellent approach in a small orchard. If it's a larger orchard, you can just mow the leaves and you can apply lime in the fall, which you probably need anyway, and the leaves will be decomposed. That just speeds up the decomposition, and that's another control. For pear scab, you can apply dormant lime sulfur as well, because there are some of the fungus will overwinter in the trees. But again, that just doesn't work on apples. Now that's my top batch that were submitted. So here's my final rule, which is don't panic. I'm afraid that I get an awful lot of emails from people that did panic and they've already done something rash or unnecessary or sad. They've damaged or destroyed a plant, or they've made it impossible to deal with the problem. And so really, don't panic. Most all of these problems that I've dealt with here, we can figure out a way to prevent them in the future. Rarely do they take a crop completely off the board. Late blight is one of the few things that will just kill plants completely. So other things, you have time to deal with it. So don't panic. So that's my final rule.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Linda. I have 8 questions that have come up during the chat, and I thought I might just plop them in and you could decide which ones you wanted to answer.
So we can do several things here. I did pull the allium root disease files out because some notes came in later about that. So I have allium root diseases and codling moth, but let's see what you got in the chat questions right now, because I've just been talking away at you guys all for an hour and a half here, and you're probably pretty tired of listening to me. So
there's the first 4 in the chat now, and the next 4 are coming.
So
there we go.
What are the questions?
I'll read them all and then you'll think about it. Okay. So Bethan said, I just removed a diseased plum tree. It had black knot aphids, curled leaf. Can I plant vegetables or dahlias in that location?
Sure. It's really sad you removed the plum tree though, but because black knot, you can prune it out, and aphids, aphids are better if you leave them alone, then the aphid predators catch up and control them. But if it was an old tree and it was just full of black knot and you're really tired of dealing with it, then don't worry about it. There's none of the black knot is the host, is the plum tree, and it won't go on vegetables. And the aphids that are on the plum trees are not the same aphids that would go on vegetables either. If you go back and look at the slides from September, you'll see that aphids are very, very host specific. Plum aphids don't go on roses, and rose aphids don't go on cabbage, and cabbage aphids don't go on beans. So you certainly can.
Kathy said, what exactly is that potato wireworm trap, please?
Potato wireworm trap?
Mm-hmm.
It's a chunk of potato. And it's got, stick a little spike into it, something like a chopstick or a twig. so that you can find it, because you take that chunk of potato, skewer it, and then bury it, just an inch or two deep in the soil in a garden bed. If you take all the weeds out of the garden bed, put a few of these potatoes around, maybe a few feet apart, and leave them for a few nights, and then go back and pull up your little potato chunk by its little twig and see if the wireworms have crawled into the potatoes. And that will tell you, well, actually it attracts the wireworms to the potatoes. They have nothing else to eat, and it'll pull them right out of the garden bed. So obviously this is useful on a small garden, not in a field, but it's quite, you can use potato chunks, you can use carrot chunks too. And you can reuse them. I'm really cheap. I reuse my potato chunks. I stick them in and take the wireworms out of them and put the little chunks back in the soil again for another few days.
All right. I noticed we're at our scheduled end time, but I think people are probably wanting to keep going. But we won't be offended if you leave at 8:30, just so you know.
Watch the video later.
Yeah. Mary Eve said, are there predatory parasitic insects that feed on destructive insects that also destroy crops that we should be aware of?
Can't think of anything. The one predatory insect that a lot of people don't like is yellow jackets, but that's just because they're afraid of being stung. I can't really think of anything. No.
Excellent. Roz Kemp says, can you please talk about the codling moth control?
I do have slides on codling moth if we want to get to them. I guess we could quickly go through these are the, here we are. Here's the codling moth slides. Codling moth, yeah, they're getting worse. Now, the reason I think they're getting worse is because we've had several long, hot summers, not last summer, but this last summer, but was very long and warm, and the previous one wasn't. But we've had, in the last 5 years, we've probably had 4 long, unusually long and warm summers. So we're getting an extra generation of codling moth. In this region, they didn't used to be very common, and 2 generations was probably all we ever got. But I think now we're getting this partial 3rd generation in September. So the hosts are apples and pears. The 1st generation, the moth comes and lays the eggs just at the tiny, tiny little fruit as it's forming. Or the eggs can even be on the twigs and the leaves right around the fruit. When the caterpillars hatch, they bore straight into the fruit. So here's problem number 1. How do you control the little critter once it's just bored right into the fruit? You can't get at it. And then they exit the fruit after feeding for a month, and they leave the tree and go down into the soil or under the bark of the trunk and spin a cocoon. And then the next generation of moths comes out and flies up to the trees and lays eggs again on the apples. And as soon as they hatch, they bore right into the apple again. So they're very, very difficult pests. So one of the main things is sanitation. Inspecting trees weekly. What you're looking for is a little hole, usually down at the blossom end of the apple. So down at this end of the apple, a small hole. And you'll have to check the apples while they're on the tree. And any time of the year that you see that, you pull those off and destroy them. The other thing is, as the crop is ripening, the early fruit that drops often is the fruit that has the caterpillars in it. The caterpillars are usually still in the apple when the fruit drops, but they won't stay in the apple. They'll burrow their way out and go into the soil. So a daily patrol around the apple tree and picking up anything that fell that day. You can throw it in a bucket of soapy water, and the caterpillars come out and die, and then you can put the apples on the compost bin. Or you can cut the apples open, take out the caterpillars, use the rest of the apple. If you've got horses or cows you want to feed the apples to, as long as you make sure that the fruit is destroyed somehow. In small quantities of fruit, if you've got the freezer space, you could even put it in the freezer to kill the caterpillar. So there's lots of ways to kill a caterpillar, but you need to do it immediately, every day, picking up the quantities of fruit that fell. Now, if you're bagging the fruit, you can prevent those moths from laying eggs on the fruit. So as soon as you've thinned your apples, if you get in there when the fruit's about nickel-sized, you thin the apples, right then you can bag it. And just leave the bag on for the rest of the season. And the moths can't lay their eggs. Nor can apple maggot, nor can birds get at them. There's a lot of things that are prevented from damaging the apple. If you use paper bags that are opaque, it's a good idea to take them off about 2 weeks before harvest so the fruit really gets red. But these sort of semi-transparent bags, you don't have to do that. They get a lovely color underneath. Any apples that aren't bagged should be pulled off the tree if you really want to do a good job on sanitation. You can try tree bands. This is a technique that's been around. What this does is you're intercepting the moths, the caterpillars, as they come out of the tree. So they've had a generation in the apples early, but now they're wandering down the tree, and you will catch them. Some of them will stop under corrugated cardboard and spin a cocoon. But unless you check those weekly and destroy the cocoons, you're better off not doing this, because they just harbor there and fly out of there. The caterpillars that would go down the tree trunk to the ground get chewed up by ground beetles and lots of other predators. So the tree bands, you have to be the predator. So if you're going to do it every week and check the tree band, that can work. But if you're not going to be able to do that, then you shouldn't use this technique. There is a product that commercial growers can use. It's called Kale and Clay, and the product is Surround. And what this does, you spray it on the tree and it leaves a fine white barrier over everything, leaves, apples, everything. But it repels the moth from laying its eggs. And the barrier is thin enough that the trees photosynthesize properly. The problem is that you have white dust on the apples, and if you're going to sell apples, they're going to have to be washed, or before they go into the market. But it's an inert product. There's no chemical there. It's just a barrier. So that's codling moth.
All right. Kathleen asks about spider mites. In a room I use for seedlings, on a shelf I use for grow lights, is there a target temperature I can heat the space to that might hopefully get rid of the hidden mites?
Just removing the plants for long enough, and scrub it all out and clean it up, vacuum out the cracks and crevices, and don't have any living plant material there. That's not a difficult problem to solve. Where it's difficult is where they're overwintering in a garden, and then you want to put another crop out and you don't even know where the mites are. But you should be able to solve that one pretty easily with just a good scrub and basically a quarantine period when there's no plants.
Marjan asks how to control or prevent leafhoppers.
Well, down here on the coast, there's not a lot of problem with leafhoppers spreading viruses. Up in the interior and grapes, there are viruses that can be spread. Not really an issue here. So other than just kind of jumping up your nose when you disturb a plant, they're not doing much. They do make these stipple marks on the leaves in the fall. But in terms of controlling them, the problem is that they can feed on a lot of different kinds of leaves, a lot of ornamental plants. And if you needed to control them, you would basically have to spray everything, and that would do more harm than good. So there's no need to control leafhoppers. They're not usually, depends what kind of, if you're a grower and you're growing roses that have leafhopper damage on the leaves, maybe you want to try and control them, but most of us are not. Most of the time, the damage they're doing is on a part of a plant that isn't going to be sold or seen or eaten. They don't harm fruit. And they don't feed on a lot of our common vegetables. So there's usually no reason to have to control them. And there's really not a feasible way to do it without having a far greater negative effect on other things.
All right, Kathleen is asking about.
And actually, I should just mention, it does happen that people see leafhoppers and associate it with other kinds of damage that they're not doing. That's something that a different pest is doing. So if you assume that leafhoppers are causing damage that's really intolerable, it may not be leafhopper. In fact, it's very unlikely to be leafhoppers. They could be just present, flying up when something else is doing the damage. So that's a thing to just make sure that you know what you're looking at.
Kathleen's asking for help identifying invasive jumping worms, especially when they're small, and anything she can do to control them if that's what they are.
I don't know about, I've heard about them, but I've never seen one, and I don't know invasive jumping worms. I'm so sorry, I don't know. I'm not even, I don't know if we even had them become established in BC. I don't think so. I've read about it. No, I'd just Google it along with everybody else here to figure out what's going on. But again, remember, when you're using Google, you can, or any of these online resources, always cross-check for local information. Make sure, I often put right in my search string, British Columbia, just to make sure we start getting some local references, because there's some pretty hair-raising pests out there in the world that have nothing to do with us.
All right, there's lots more questions rolling in. We're not going to get to answer them all tonight, but I have captured them, and I'll share them with you, Linda.
Okay.
That sounds good.
I don't know if we want to do the allium root diseases or just let everybody.
Why don't we end with that? Does that sound good?
Well, it's a huge section, so I'll go through it fairly quickly.
Okay.
Allium root diseases, and alliums are that whole family: onions, garlic, leeks. Garlic particularly seems to get clobbered with a lot of different root diseases. Remember, these are all soil borne, meaning those organisms live in the soil. So some of them, like I say, garlic seems to be worst affected. They're ones that are just a bit of cosmetic damage, Amblysia, which I'll show you in a minute. And if you're a garlic grower and you get white rot, frankly, it's going to be so hard to deal with that. You're probably out of business of growing garlic. You might be better off growing something else. So we range from something that isn't even really an issue to something that's quite commercially damaging. So how to tell them apart? Commonly, we have botrytis species, and there's 6 or 7 different ones that live in the soil that can get onto our bulbs. And they cause neck rots, this bluish gray mold. And they have funny little spore structures called sclerotia, little black structures. And this is typical. Here's a healthy looking bulb, but the neck is rotted. But the roots are healthy looking, so bear that in mind. Fusarium, very common. Everybody's got it in their soil. It's present pretty much everywhere. But when conditions are right, such as when you have been growing onions or garlic in the same bed for a few years in a row, you get these orangey pinky infections with white moldy. The mold is actually white, but the infected tissue can be orange or pink. It's spread, on crop debris. It thrives in wet soil. In warm soil. It's quite common. And then we have blue mold or green mold rot. It's a various penicillium species. And this is a bluish green kind of mold. And frankly, a really deteriorated bulb of garlic, sick from anything, they can all look about exactly the same. But the one thing you do see here is that there was good roots on this plant before it was before it was harvested. And a lot of these pathogens get into the roots, and you pull the garlic and the crop doesn't look too bad, and then you cure it and store it, and these continue. Then you go back to your garlic cupboard and take it out, and all of a sudden you've got these really moldy, soft roots or cloves. Now, this is the one it looks like you've been handling coal dust or something, or soot. As you start peeling the papers off your garlic, you see these black powder. It's a recently introduced disease. This is the only one that spreads on the wind. And thank heavens, it's mostly cosmetic. If you just take off the outer layers of the garlic bulb, the cloves underneath are fine. It's rare. It can happen that the cloves are damaged, but basically it is a cosmetic thing. And then we have the dreaded white rot, which is the opposite of what I just showed you. The fungus stays in these funny spore structures. They look like poppy seeds, actually, called sclerotia, and they can be there for up to 20 years. They are just like clubroot in the sense that they wait until the roots of the onion family plants have come near them, and it causes them to germinate. So they start their infection from the roots at the base of the plant. The ideal conditions are, middle temperatures, moist soil. And this one, it's just the same as I was talking about with clubroot. It can be spread on the plant material. It can be in the soil, on the tools, on the that you're using, on your boots. Animals fed infected material can pass it out in their manure. It can spread over the surface of the field on water. They're coming from an infected field. And all of these are, well, except the Embolicia, are problematical in that once the bulbs have deteriorated enough, you can't tell by looking at it what it is. Identifying white rot, or actually any of these organisms, is really a job for a pathologist. If you're a home gardener, you know, this is going to be very expensive and probably not worth it. But if you're a grower, this is essential, because, you know, the difference between having some penicillium, blue mold rot in your garlic, and having white rot are two very different things. So, you know, white rot, the roots are destroyed first, you have the sclerotia, but any really badly deteriorated bulb is going to look like this. So you really need to send those samples in. A lot of things are not white rot. This is a blue mold. This is probably the neck rot that I showed you. This is fusarium, but there's a lot of people think that because white rot is called white rot, that any white fluff, which is the fungal mycelium and spores, they think that that is also white rot. It's just white mold, but it's not this disease called white rot. So preventing white rot's a whole other thing. And actually, I'm going to go quickly to here. Most of these allium diseases are managed by 4-year crop rotation. The botrytis neck rot, the blue mold rot, the basil fusarium that I showed you, the pinky one. You don't have to really identify all of these. You just need to be sure that you're rotating the crops. And also, if you're a grower, not using cereal crops in rotation, because that can host the strains that infect garlic. For white rot and Embolicia blotch, well, crop rotation helps. Embolicia is also spread on the wind, so pretty much everybody's going to have Embolicia. I've got it this year on mine. It's not really an issue. But white rot, I'll go back, is because it's such a devastating and long-term disease. Again, your best approach is to not get it. The only way you get it is bringing it in on infected material or on soil or cultivating equipment or manure, things like that. Now, if you've been growing garlic and your garlic is healthy, frankly, you're far better off continuing to grow your own garlic over and over, using your own garlic as seed, because you're not bringing in garlic from elsewhere. Bringing garlic from elsewhere is really risky. These bunched onions, these fresh, they're usually Walla Walla sweet or one of the Spanish onions that you'll see. This is a great way to have a high risk of bringing in white rot. These are grown in big fields in Washington State. And, you know, so grow your own onions from seed. Don't buy bunched seedlings. Now, if you get it, you can continue to grow garlic with great care. But if you're a commercial grower, it would be better if you didn't, because you don't know that your garlic is going out there, and there's always a possibility of spores on it. And the next person will take that garlic and they may plant it instead of eat it. And that's how it gets moved around. However, that's just my opinion. It doesn't, you know, people are not mandatorily told not to grow their garlic. Go ahead and they can do what they feel is right. But anytime you see a plant beginning to fail in a field, take a shovel and remove the plant, the root, and some soil around it, and put it in a pail and have a really good look. Like, you want to get 6 inches of 15 centimeters in every direction, bag it. If you know you have white rot in the field, then you should destroy it. If you don't, that's a good sample to take to send to the lab. And ideally, you never use infected beds for alliums ever again, because remember, you can grow anything else there. It's not a problem. It won't affect anything else. So clean your tools. Now, various approaches have been tried in commercial garlic fields to keep being able to grow garlic. And one of the things you can do is fake out the spores, but it's hard to have a consistent result. There are actually some products now sold, like commercial products, you don't have any garlic or any onions growing in the field, but you put the juice or a artificial stimulant in the soil, and it causes the spores to germinate because the pathogen thinks, it senses the scent or the odor from the onions, the chemical that comes from the onions, and it causes it to germinate, but there's no allium crop, so it can't survive. So you can try that. Again, it's, I'd read up more on this. There was a lot of work done at Oregon State University on this, but the researcher is not there anymore, unfortunately. But it's possible. Your best bet for all of these is crop rotation and just absolute care and sanitation. I think that's it, because we've done the codling moth. Okay, that's it. You got the garlic diseases. If you're really feeling like you would like some more information, I do have a PDF. You'll have to send me an email, and I will send you a PDF out of my book with a chart showing how to identify the different ones. But I cannot emphasize enough that if it's a critical situation for commercial crops, you must send in the specimens to a plant pathologist. We just cannot identify it by pictures or by looking at it.
Thank you so much, Linda. This last little section on allium diseases and the root rots was just what we needed, because there was a lot of questions about that before and during your talk. So thank you for that extra bit of time. And again, your incredible generosity with your time. It's just fantastic. I'm a representative of the Farmland Trust, and we have hosted Linda here today. And we're going to be getting these recordings to all of you that have registered as soon as possible, with the assistance of Kaya, who has provided us the technical support. And these recordings will also be on our website. And we'll get them to the registrants, and we'll also get them onto our website. So I'm going to say adieu tonight, have a wonderful evening for the rest of it, and looking forward to once again working with Linda in the future with similar programs. Thank you, Linda.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for donating.